Welcome to the Dibley Diaries for this week. This week we're thinking about understanding, in particular understanding God, or what that means for us. And preparing for this week, I was thinking about understanding all the rules in the Church of England. And there are many, many rules in the Church of England about all sorts of things. So there are rules about the church building and the grounds which they own, particularly if they are historical church buildings. There are rules about how you have your worship services, about who can lead what sort of service, even about how you might behave in a particular way in a particular service. Just the other day I was explaining to the congregation where we were worshipping, I was leading a morning worship service, so not a communion service, which was a rare thing for me to be doing. But I was saying to people, well, this reading that we're having is a New Testament reading, not really a gospel reading, because you only have gospel readings where you'd normally stand in communion services. So we're not going to stand up for this reading, even though it's from Luke. So, and someone later said, I never really understood how that rule worked, what that rule was about. So all sorts of rules, all sorts of things about buildings, about caring for our buildings. And they seem very complicated. If you are weighed down by the rules which affect your life in the Church of England community, it's important to remember that they're there for the reason of protecting our church communities and the buildings that our church communities are custodians of. There is always someone you can check a rule with, and if they don't know the answer, they will then check that rule for you. So don't despair. The rules are there to put in a framework to protect both our worshipping community and the buildings which we care for. In Thought for the Week, this week we're thinking about two passages, the Isaiah 55 passage, which we have set for today, and the passage from Luke chapter 13, which is the gospel passage set for today. But I want to start in the Isaiah passage because that is a really important passage, I think, and there's two verses in particular I really like, and they are verses 8 and 9. I'm going to read them now. For my thoughts are not your thoughts, says the Lord, nor are your ways my ways. For as the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, and my thoughts than your thoughts. I really like this passage because it reminds us that we cannot understand all of God. We can't understand all of God, and we can't understand all the things that happen. So I think that's a really important thing to remember for us. I grew up in the 1980s, and we were still very much part of that Enlightenment project, where we were trying to understand everything, that we believed that everything could be understood, and we were doing all sorts of things to try to understand God and the Bible and all those sorts of things in a very sort of rational way. But I think as part of that rationality, we also need to accept that God is infinite and we are finite, and we can't understand him. We can't understand all of God's thoughts. And that's really useful for us as we struggle with things that are happening. Now, in the Luke passage, there's two stories. One is a story which contains terrible tragedy. Jesus is challenged to explain some terrible things that are happening, and how does Jesus explain that? But Jesus doesn't explain that. He tells a story, but his story is a very different sort of story. So his story is about two men and a fig tree. The fig tree isn't producing figs, and the owner of the vineyard says, well, cut it down. It's just using up all the goodness in the earth. Cut it down. And the gardener says, no, No, I'll look after it and we'll see what's happening next year. So the gardener is challenging the owner that actually something good, which isn't expected, could happen. And I think that's interesting when we think about it, alongside the fact that we can't understand God, because there are many situations where God lets terrible things happen and we don't understand them. We don't understand why God would let them happen, and there's tragedies all the time, and Jesus was challenged about this. Why did these terrible things happen? But also there are plenty of times where something really good happens and we're also not expecting that either. Sometimes when the fig tree does grow when we're not expecting it to. Sometimes when things happen that we are not expecting to happen. And so how do we accept that we don't understand what God is doing? Sometimes terrible things will happen and we won't understand why God will let those things happen. Sometimes really good things will happen and we will be surprised that God has brought those really, really good things to pass. But actually when we reflect back on the Isaiah, we won't understand what God is doing because we can't understand God, because his thoughts are different to our thoughts. And sometimes that's a really helpful thing to remember when things are happening that we don't understand why God is letting bad things happening or how good things happen. It's okay if we don't understand what God is doing there, because actually it's okay if we don't understand God. The Dibley moment for the week this week is a poignant Dibley moment rather than a comedic Dibley moment, but it ties in with the things that we've been thinking about this week. Quite a few years ago now, I was working in a small village and a terrible tragedy happened, and I went to see the family who'd suffered this terrible tragedy, and I didn't really know what to say to them. I remember praying on the way up to visit them. Actually, I have no idea what I'm saying, or please help me to say the right thing. One of the things which I said to them while I was there during the visit was that I was not there to make excuses for God, that they would have to fight their own battle with him about how he had let this terrible thing happen. And we got on with practical things that we needed to see to as a result of the tragedy. And then about a year later, I bumped into one of those family members at a kind of social event, asked how they were doing, and they said, you know, the most helpful thing you said to us, that we would have to fight our own battle with God about why he had let this happen. So yes, not understanding. Sometimes it's okay to say that you just don't understand how God could have let something happen, and not to even try and think of excuses or reasons, because some things are just terrible things. Well, that's it for the Dibley Diaries for this week. I pray that you and your village, however large or small, have a really blessed week where God can do something really good that you don't understand and that you weren't expecting.